The strongest people are rarely the loudest. They are the ones who refuse to look away when everyone else does. I never imagined that one ordinary Friday night would teach me that lesson inside the most elegant ballroom I had ever seen. My name is Grace Parker, and at 25 years old, my life was about as ordinary as it could be. I rented a tiny apartment in Brooklyn with unreliable heating, worked evening shifts as a waitress at the Hawthorne Grand Hotel in Manhattan, and stretched every paycheck until the next one arrived. My dreams were simple: pay my bills, help my mother whenever I could, save enough money to return to school someday. Nothing about my life suggested that I would ever cross paths with someone whose name could silence an entire room. That evening, the hotel hosted one of the city's largest charity galas. Crystal chandeliers reflected across polished marble floors, while a live orchestra filled the ballroom with soft music that floated through the air like a slow winter snowfall. Every table sparkled beneath white candles and perfectly arranged roses. Guests arrived wearing tailored tuxedos, designer gowns, and watches that probably cost more than my car. They smiled for photographers, shook hands with politicians, and spoke confidently about companies, investments, and international business. I moved quietly between them, carrying silver trays filled with sparkling water and champagne, reminding myself that invisible employees usually had easier nights. "Grace, keep the east side covered," my supervisor whispered as he hurried past me. "Some very important people are arriving." I nodded and continued serving drinks. After nearly 3 years working luxury events, I had learned that every guest believed someone else in the room mattered even more than they did. Power had its own invisible language. Then everything changed without anyone making an announcement. Conversations faded one after another until the ballroom became strangely quiet. Even the orchestra softened its music. Curious, I glanced toward the entrance just as several well-dressed men stepped inside, calmly spreading through the room without speaking. They were professional, attentive, and completely composed. A second later, the man everyone had been waiting for entered behind them. Damian Sullivan did not need to raise his voice or demand attention. Somehow the room simply offered it. Executives straightened their jackets. Public officials paused in the middle of conversations. Even people who had spent the evening laughing suddenly stood a little taller. I frowned slightly. Fame usually created excitement. This felt different. This felt like respect mixed with caution. "Do not stare," another waitress whispered as she walked beside me. "That is Damian Sullivan." "Who?" I asked honestly. She looked at me as though I had confessed I had never heard of New York City. "Seriously?" I nodded. "Just keep working," she muttered before disappearing into the crowd. I did exactly that. I cleared empty glasses, delivered fresh drinks, and smiled politely whenever someone thanked me. A few minutes later, I noticed an elderly maintenance worker struggling with a heavy supply cart near the ballroom entrance. One wheel caught the edge of an expensive rug, sending neatly folded white table linens tumbling across the polished floor. The older man immediately knelt, apologizing as he reached for the scattered fabric with shaking hands. Several guests stepped around him without slowing their conversations. One impatient donor sighed loudly. "Can someone move him? He is blocking the entrance." Nobody bent down to help. Nobody even acknowledged him. It was as though the man had become part of the furniture the moment he interrupted the evening's elegance. I looked at the tray in my hands, then back at the elderly worker. My supervisor would probably be frustrated if I left my station. Another server could cover my section for a minute. Maybe someone else would step in. They did not. Without thinking any longer, I placed my tray carefully on the nearest table and walked straight toward him. "Let me help you," I said with a warm smile as I knelt beside him and gathered the fallen linens before he could apologize again. "These things happen." "Thank you," he whispered, clearly embarrassed. "I did not mean to cause trouble." "You did not," I replied gently. "You were just doing your job." I handed him the last folded cloth and helped steady the cart before standing once more. That was when I noticed something I had completely missed. The ballroom had fallen silent again, and when I slowly turned around, I realized every guest in the room was watching me. Standing only a few yards away, Damian Sullivan had not taken his eyes off me for a single second. The elderly maintenance worker gripped the handle of his cart again, his hands still trembling slightly as he offered me another grateful smile before quietly making his way toward the service hallway. I watched until I was certain he no longer needed help, then reached for my serving tray. That was when I realized the ballroom had not returned to normal. Hundreds of conversations had simply stopped. Crystal glasses remained suspended halfway to waiting lips. Even the orchestra had lowered its volume until the music barely drifted through the room. Every pair of eyes seemed fixed on one person. Unfortunately, that person was me. I took a slow breath and lifted the tray, hoping everyone would lose interest if I simply returned to work. Before I could take my first step, Damian Sullivan walked toward me with an unhurried confidence that somehow made the silence even heavier. Nobody dared interrupt him. Nobody even crossed his path. It was almost as though the ballroom itself quietly moved aside. He stopped a comfortable distance away, leaving enough space that I never felt cornered. His expression remained calm, almost thoughtful. "What is your name?" he asked. His voice was steady and surprisingly quiet, forcing everyone else to remain silent if they wanted to hear. "Grace Parker," I answered. He nodded once. "How long have you worked here, Grace?" "Almost 3 years." "Do you always leave your station to help someone you have never met?" I glanced toward the hallway where the maintenance worker had disappeared. "Only when nobody else does." A few guests exchanged uneasy looks. One businessman standing nearby cleared his throat before speaking carefully. "Mr. Sullivan, the charity presentation is about to begin." Damian never looked away from me. "They can wait another minute." The businessman immediately stepped back without another word. I noticed my supervisor standing across the room with an expression that mixed panic and complete disbelief. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Damian spoke again. Most people continued walking. I noticed. "You did not." I smiled politely. "Someone needed help. That was all." I shrugged. "Does there have to be another reason?" He studied my face for a few quiet seconds, almost as though he expected another answer to appear if he waited long enough. "Do you know who I am?" he finally asked. I decided the truth would probably be easier than pretending. "I know your name now." A faint ripple of surprise moved through the crowd. "And?" he asked. "And that does not tell me much about the kind of person you are." Several guests looked genuinely uncomfortable. One woman lowered her champagne glass without taking another sip. I could almost hear people wondering whether I had just made the biggest mistake of my life. Damian remained completely composed. Most people form an opinion before speaking to me. That sounds exhausting. The corner of his mouth lifted ever so slightly. Sometimes it is. I adjusted the tray in my hands. People spend a lot of time reacting to titles. "Do you?" he asked. I shook my head. "No." "Why not?" I answered without thinking very long, because the answer had been part of my life long before this evening. Because titles explain what someone does. They do not explain who someone is. The words settled over the ballroom like the final note of a song. Nobody interrupted. Nobody laughed. Even the orchestra had stopped playing entirely now. Damian looked at me with an expression I could not quite understand. It was not surprise alone. It looked more like recognition, as though he had unexpectedly heard something familiar after years of listening to the wrong conversations. Finally, he spoke again. "Grace Parker." I cannot remember the last time someone answered my questions without trying to impress me. I met his eyes and smiled faintly. "That is probably because I was never trying to impress you." "Then what were you trying to do?" I glanced toward the service hallway one last time before looking back at him. I was trying to make sure an elderly man did not feel invisible. For the first time since entering the ballroom, Damian's reserved expression softened into the smallest genuine smile. And in that single quiet moment, every influential guest in the room seemed to realize they had just witnessed something none of them had expected. The silence lingered for another few seconds before the orchestra cautiously resumed playing, as though the musicians had finally been given permission to breathe again. Around us, conversations slowly returned, but they sounded different now. Instead of discussing business deals or political campaigns, guests whispered to one another while glancing in my direction. I picked up my tray and prepared to excuse myself. "I should get back to work," I said. Damian inclined his head slightly. Of course. I expected that to be the end of our conversation. Instead, he spoke again before I could take another step. "Grace." I turned back. "Yes." "When does your shift end?" The question caught me off guard. "Around 11:30. Would you allow me to buy you a cup of coffee afterward?" I blinked once, convinced I had misunderstood him. "Coffee?" "Yes." I looked around the ballroom. Several executives had stopped pretending not to listen. A city councilman standing near the stage suddenly became fascinated by the champagne in his glass. Even my supervisor seemed frozen in place. Apparently, everyone wanted to hear my answer. I smiled awkwardly. That is not what I expected you to ask. What did you expect? Honestly, always. I thought you were going to tell me I had embarrassed someone important. A quiet laugh escaped him, warm enough that it briefly erased the distance everyone else seemed to place between themselves and him. You did the opposite. Really, you reminded an entire room what this charity event was supposed to represent. His answer surprised me more than the invitation itself. Before I could respond, one of the event organizers approached with an apologetic smile. Mr. Sullivan, everyone is waiting for you to begin the opening ceremony. Damien acknowledged him with a polite nod. I will be there in a moment. The organizer hesitated for a fraction of a second before quietly stepping away. I looked back at Damien. You should not keep an entire ballroom waiting because of a waitress. I am not keeping them waiting because of a waitress. His expression remained calm. I am finishing a conversation with someone worth listening to. I did not know what to say to that. Compliments had never made me comfortable, especially unexpected ones. I shifted the tray to my other hand. I appreciate the invitation, but I barely know you. That is true. And you barely know me. Also true. Then why coffee? He answered without hesitation. Because for the first time in a very long while, someone spoke to me without calculating what they might gain from the conversation. His honesty made it difficult to dismiss the invitation as simple politeness. Still, I had learned to trust my instincts before my curiosity. I do not usually meet strangers after work, I admitted. I would be disappointed if you did. His answer immediately caught my attention. Why? Because caution is wisdom, not rudeness. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed a simple business card before placing it gently on the edge of a nearby table instead of handing it directly to me. There is a neighborhood cafe across the street that stays open late. If you decide you would like to continue our conversation, I will be there after your shift. If you decide not to come, I will respect that completely. He took one small step backward, making it clear that the choice belonged entirely to me. There was no pressure hidden inside his words. No expectation, only an invitation. I looked at the card resting beside my serving tray, but made no move to pick it up. You are giving me a lot of freedom for someone people describe as very powerful. A thoughtful smile crossed his face. Real respect cannot exist without freedom. Before I could answer, he inclined his head one final time. Enjoy the rest of your evening, Grace. Then he turned and walked toward the stage where the charity program was finally ready to begin. The room immediately shifted with him, yet somehow my attention stayed fixed on the plain white business card lying quietly beside my tray. It contained only his name and the address of the cafe across the street. No title, no company logo, nothing designed to impress anyone. I slipped the card carefully into my apron pocket and returned to serving the remaining guests. But no matter how many glasses I collected or tables I cleared, one question stayed with me until the final minutes of my shift. Would crossing that street change nothing at all, or would it quietly change everything? By the time the final guest drifted toward the hotel entrance, the ballroom no longer looked like the glamorous place that had dazzled the city only a few hours earlier. Candles had burned low. Fresh roses were being gathered into large carts. Hotel employees quietly folded white tablecloths while the orchestra packed away their instruments one careful piece at a time. I untied my apron, slipped it into my backpack, and finally reached into the front pocket where Damien's business card had rested all evening. It was surprisingly plain. Thick white paper. His name. The address of a neighborhood cafe across the street. Nothing more. No impressive title. No company name. No reminder of the influence everyone else seemed to associate with him. I turned the card over once before sliding it back into my pocket. My supervisor appeared beside me as I signed out for the night. Grace, he said, lowering his voice. I have managed events at this hotel for almost 25 years. That is a long time. Long enough to know that tonight was unlike anything I have ever seen. I smiled politely. Because I helped the maintenance worker? No. He shook his head. Because Damien Sullivan spent nearly 10 minutes talking to a waitress while an entire ballroom waited. I laughed softly. It was not that dramatic. From where I was standing, it absolutely was. He studied my expression for a moment before asking, Are you going? I already knew what he meant. I have not decided. He looked genuinely surprised. Most people would not hesitate. That might be exactly why I should. He nodded slowly. Fair point. A few minutes later, I stepped outside into the cool Manhattan night. The streets glistened beneath recent rain, reflecting rows of golden streetlights across the pavement. The cafe stood directly across the avenue, its large front windows glowing warmly against the darkness. Through the glass, I could see only a handful of customers quietly talking over coffee. I remained on the sidewalk instead of crossing immediately. Every sensible thought told me to head toward the subway. I barely knew Damien. One conversation did not reveal someone's character. Curiosity was never a substitute for good judgment. Then I remembered something else. Throughout the entire evening, he had never assumed I owed him my time. He had asked permission. He had accepted uncertainty without complaint. He had left the decision entirely in my hands. That mattered. Taking a slow breath, I crossed the street and pushed open the cafe door. A small brass bell chimed overhead as the comforting aroma of freshly brewed coffee wrapped around me. The room felt cozy rather than fashionable, with wooden tables, handwritten menus, and soft jazz playing quietly through hidden speakers. Near the back window sat Damien, alone, reading a well-worn hardcover book while a simple black coffee rested beside him. When he noticed me, he immediately closed the book and stood. There was no dramatic gesture, no performance, just a warm smile that seemed completely genuine. "Good evening, Grace," he said. "Thank you for coming. Thank you for giving me the choice." He pulled out the chair across from him, but waited for me to sit first before taking his own seat again. A waitress approached with a friendly smile. "Good to see you again, Mr. Sullivan." "The usual?" "Please," he replied before looking at me. "And whatever Grace would like." I glanced at the menu for a moment before smiling. "A vanilla latte, please." After she walked away, a comfortable silence settled between us. It was not awkward. It felt peaceful, almost unexpected after the intensity of the evening we had just shared. I rested my hands on the wooden table and looked at him. "You know," I admitted with a small smile, "I almost went straight home." He nodded as though that answer pleased him. "I hoped you would choose whatever made you feel comfortable. What if I had not come?" He looked toward the rain sliding slowly down the cafe window before meeting my eyes again. "Then I would have finished my coffee, wished you well from a distance, and been grateful that at least one honest conversation had found its way into my evening." In that quiet little cafe, surrounded by ordinary people finishing ordinary days, I realized the most remarkable thing about Damien Sullivan was not that he could command a ballroom full of influential strangers. It was that he seemed perfectly content sharing a simple cup of coffee with someone who had absolutely nothing to offer except the truth. The waitress returned with my vanilla latte and Damien's black coffee, placing both mugs on the table with an easy smile before leaving us alone again. I wrapped my hands around the warm ceramic cup, grateful for the heat after the cool walk across the street. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. The quiet did not feel uncomfortable. It felt earned. Around us, the little cafe continued its ordinary rhythm. A college student highlighted notes for an upcoming exam. An older couple shared a slice of apple pie near the front window. Someone behind the counter softly hummed along with the jazz music playing overhead. It was almost strange to think that less than an hour earlier we had been surrounded by flashing cameras and some of the most influential people in the city. Damien broke the silence first. "Thank you for trusting your instincts instead of other people's opinions." I smiled into my cup. "You assume my instincts led me here. Did they not?" I looked at him for a moment before answering. "Partly. Curiosity helped." His expression brightened with quiet amusement. "Curiosity is underrated." I laughed softly. "It can also get people into trouble. That depends on what they are curious about." I took my first sip of the latte. It was smooth, warm, and somehow exactly what I needed after a long shift. "Can I ask you something?" "You can ask me anything." "Why did you really invite me here?" He rested both hands around his coffee mug before answering. "Because tonight, everyone spoke to me as though they had already decided who I was." He looked directly at me. "You were the only person who decided to find out for yourself." I considered his words carefully. "Maybe that is because I still do not know who you are. Neither do most people." There was no bitterness in his voice, only honesty. "They know stories. They know headlines. They know rumors. Very few people bother asking questions." I nodded slowly. "My father used to tell me that reputations travel much faster than truth." Was he usually right? "Almost always." A thoughtful smile crossed Damien's face. "He sounds like a wise man." He believed every person deserved one honest conversation before they deserved an opinion. Damien remained quiet for a moment, as though turning those words over in his mind. I wish more people believed that. I looked out the cafe window where a light drizzle had replaced the earlier rain. Can I be honest? I hope so. When everyone stopped talking after you walked into the ballroom, I thought they respected you. And now, I look back at him. Now I am not sure whether they respected you or simply feared disappointing someone important. He did not rush to defend himself. Instead, he asked another question. Do you think there is a difference? A very big one. I leaned back slightly. Respect stays when nobody is watching. Fear disappears the moment it becomes safe. The sentence lingered between us. Damien lowered his eyes briefly before smiling almost to himself. You have a habit of saying things people avoid saying. Maybe people think too much before they speak. And you? I try to think about whether something is true before I think about whether it is popular. He laughed quietly, shaking his head. Grace, I have attended board meetings with billion-dollar decisions that felt less honest than this conversation. Before I could respond, the cafe owner approached carrying a small plate with 2 warm chocolate chip cookies. Fresh from the oven, he said cheerfully. These are on the house. I immediately reached for my wallet. I cannot let you do that. The owner smiled. Last winter you stayed after closing to help my wife carry supplies inside during the snowstorm. She still remembers. I stared at him, surprised. I only helped for a few minutes. Sometimes a few minutes are all people remember. He wished us a pleasant evening before returning behind the counter. I looked down at the cookie in front of me, then back at Damien. He had witnessed the entire exchange without saying a word. Finally, he smiled. You spent the evening believing I noticed kindness. He gently slid the second cookie toward me. What you have not realized yet is that kindness has been quietly noticing you for a very long time, even when you never expected anyone to remember. The cafe had grown even quieter by the time we finished the warm cookies. Outside, the rain had finally stopped, leaving the streets covered in shimmering reflections from passing taxis and glowing storefronts. I leaned back in my chair and watched people hurry home beneath umbrellas they no longer needed. Everyone seemed focused on getting somewhere. For the first time in weeks, I realized I was not in any hurry at all. Damien appeared equally content to let the silence settle between us. It was the kind of silence that only exists when 2 people stop trying to impress each other. Just then the front door opened with a soft chime, allowing a cool breeze to drift inside. A young mother entered carrying a sleepy little girl wrapped in a bright yellow winter coat. The child rubbed her eyes while the woman searched through her purse at the counter. After counting a few wrinkled dollar bills twice, the mother offered an apologetic smile to the waitress. I thought I had enough for 2 hot chocolates, she said quietly. I guess I was wrong. The waitress smiled kindly. You are only $3 short. The woman sighed softly before looking down at her daughter. Then I will just get one for her. Before I had time to think about it, I stood and walked toward the counter. I placed a $10 bill beside the register. Please make it 2, I said. And if there is anything left, use it for the next family that comes in. The young mother immediately turned toward me. You really do not have to. I smiled gently. I know. That is why I want to. The little girl looked up at me with sleepy blue eyes and whispered, Thank you. I smiled back. You are very welcome. They carried their steaming cups to a small table near the window while I returned to my seat. Damien had watched the entire exchange without interrupting. Before I could say anything, he glanced through the front window toward the sidewalk outside. An elderly man stood beneath a street lamp holding a violin case, carefully folding a worn blanket before preparing to leave for the night. Without saying a word, Damien stood. Excuse me for a minute. I watched him cross the street alone. Instead of approaching the violinist immediately, he stepped into the neighborhood deli beside the cafe. A few minutes later, he emerged carrying a paper bag and a large cup of hot coffee. He walked over to the elderly musician, greeted him with an easy smile, handed him the meal, and shook his hand before quietly returning. There were no cameras, no audience. No one inside the cafe even noticed except me. When he sat down again, I looked at him curiously. You bought him dinner. He seemed almost surprised by the observation. He looked like he had been standing in the cold for a long time. You did not tell him your name. He did not ask. I tilted my head slightly. Most people in your position would probably want to be recognized. Damien wrapped his hands around his coffee mug once more. Recognition is pleasant, but it is a terrible reason to help someone. His answer lingered with me. I looked back through the window where the elderly musician had already taken a grateful sip of his coffee before carefully placing the paper bag inside his violin case. There was something deeply comforting about watching kindness happen without applause. You know, I admitted quietly, before tonight I assumed powerful people spent most of their time trying to prove how important they were. Damien smiled faintly. The secure ones usually do not. Then what do they spend their time proving? He looked out at the city lights glowing across the wet pavement before answering. Nothing. Eventually, you learn that the people who matter already know your character, and the people who refuse to believe it cannot be convinced anyway. I sat quietly, realizing that the image the world carried of Damien Sullivan suddenly seemed much smaller than the man sitting across from me. The ballroom had introduced me to his reputation. This quiet little cafe had introduced me to something far more valuable, a side of him that no headline, no rumor, and no whispered story could ever fully explain. The next morning I expected life to return to normal. I expected the cafe conversation to become one of those rare memories that quietly faded beneath the weight of everyday responsibilities. Instead, I woke up thinking about something Damien had said. The people who mattered already knew his character. The sentence stayed with me throughout the morning while I cleaned my apartment, answered a few messages from my mother, and sorted through a stack of books I had promised to donate weeks earlier. By early afternoon, I loaded 2 cardboard boxes into the trunk of my aging sedan and drove to the Riverside Community Center, a place I had volunteered at occasionally since college. The building was not impressive from the outside. Its brick walls showed their age, and the front steps had been repaired more than once over the years. But every time I walked through those doors, I remembered why places like this mattered. Children's laughter echoed through the hallways. Bright drawings covered nearly every wall. Volunteers greeted one another by their first names instead of job titles. It felt like a place where people were measured by kindness instead of accomplishments. Grace, the receptionist called with a warm smile as I carried the first box inside. Perfect timing. The kids are decorating for spring. Looks like I brought enough books to keep everyone busy, I replied. After setting the donations beside the office, I followed the sound of excited voices toward the activity room. The moment I stepped through the doorway, I stopped walking. Damien Sullivan stood near a long craft table wearing faded blue jeans, a navy sweater, and comfortable sneakers instead of the tailored suits I had seen the night before. He was helping a little boy tape colorful paper butterflies onto a bulletin board while 2 young girls proudly showed him paintings covered in bright flowers. He accepted every drawing as though it belonged in a museum. He remembered every child's name without hesitation. There were no photographers, no reporters, no audience waiting to applaud. There was only laughter. Damien looked up just as one of the children pointed toward me. Genuine surprise crossed his face before a familiar smile appeared. "Grace," he said, "I was not expecting to see you today." I laughed softly. I think I was about to say the same thing. Before either of us could continue, the community center director walked over carrying a clipboard. "You two know each other?" she asked cheerfully. "We met last night," I answered. She smiled knowingly before turning to me. "Then you already know how generous Mr. Sullivan is." I glanced at Damien, who suddenly looked far more interested in the paper butterflies than the conversation. "He has quietly supported this center for years," the director continued. "The reading room, the tutoring program, the after-school meals, the new computers. Half of what these children enjoy exists because he insisted nobody should have to choose between opportunity and circumstance." I looked back at Damien. "You never mentioned any of this." He shrugged lightly. "You never asked. Why keep it quiet?" I asked. He carefully helped a little girl hang another paper butterfly before answering. "Because if kindness becomes a performance, eventually the audience matters more than the people you are trying to help." His words settled deeply inside me. The children surrounding him did not care about his reputation, his influence, or the whispers that followed his name. They only cared that he remembered birthdays, celebrated good report cards, and listened when they talked about dreams that seemed much bigger than their small neighborhood. As I watched one little boy proudly hand Damien a handmade card covered in crooked letters and bright crayons, I realized I was seeing the part of his life that almost nobody else ever talked about. The ballroom had introduced me to the man everyone watched. This simple community center introduced me to the man who quietly watched over everyone else. expecting absolutely nothing in return. I spent the rest of the afternoon at the community center helping children organize books, clean art supplies, and prepare for the upcoming spring reading program. Every few minutes I caught myself watching Damien without meaning to. He never positioned himself at the center of attention. If anything, he quietly stepped away whenever someone else deserved the spotlight. When one little girl successfully read an entire page aloud for the first time, he applauded louder than anyone else in the room. When another child became frustrated over a model airplane that refused to stay together, Damien sat beside him on the floor for nearly 20 minutes until the last wing finally fit into place. There was remarkable patience in everything he did. Not the patience of someone performing kindness, but of someone who genuinely believed people were worth slowing down for. As the afternoon came to an end, volunteers began stacking chairs while parents arrived to pick up their children. One by one, the room slowly emptied until only a handful of us remained. I carried a box of craft supplies into the storage room when I heard familiar footsteps behind me. "Need some help?" Damien asked. "Only if you promise not to organize everything better than I can." He smiled. "I will do my best to disappoint you." We both laughed as he lifted the heavier box onto the top shelf with effortless ease. When we stepped back into the hallway, the director walked past carrying several folders. "Grace," she said, "would you mind locking the reading room before you leave?" "Of course." After she disappeared around the corner, Damien looked toward the small library at the end of the hallway. "May I see it? You have helped fund it for years, and you have never been inside." He shook his head. "I wanted the children to feel like it belonged to them, not to me." That answer somehow did not surprise me anymore. I unlocked the reading room and pushed open the door. Afternoon sunlight poured through wide windows, filling the shelves with a warm golden glow. Colorful beanbags rested beneath a large mural of forests, mountains, and stars. Hundreds of children's books lined the walls from floor to ceiling. Everything about the room felt peaceful. Damien slowly walked between the shelves, gently running his fingertips across the spines of well-loved books. Many showed signs of being read over and over again. "These are my favorite kind," he said quietly. "The ones that look worn?" I asked. "The ones that remind you someone stayed long enough to imagine a different future." I looked at him thoughtfully. "Did books matter that much when you were younger?" For the first time since I had met him, he did not answer immediately. He stopped beside a small wooden rocking chair near the window. "When I was 12 years old," he said softly, "my public library became the only place where nobody expected anything from me except curiosity." His voice remained calm, yet something inside it had changed. The librarians never asked why I stayed until closing almost every evening. They simply made sure there was always another book waiting. I could almost picture the lonely boy he had once been. "Someone believed in you before anyone else did." He nodded once. Sometimes one quiet act of kindness becomes the reason another person survives difficult years without losing hope. We stood together in comfortable silence until my eyes settled on a framed photograph hanging beside the reading room entrance. It showed the grand opening ceremony from several years earlier. Teachers smiled beside volunteers. Children held balloons. Near the back of the picture stood Damien, almost hidden behind everyone else, applauding while the ribbon was being cut by a young student instead of himself. He had chosen to stand where almost no one would notice him. I turned toward him with a gentle smile. "You always seem happiest when someone else gets the credit." He looked at the photograph before meeting my eyes again. "Because applause fades," he said quietly, "but confidence placed inside another human being can echo for the rest of their life." After we locked the reading room, we stepped outside, into the cool evening air. The last colors of sunset had faded beyond the skyline, leaving Manhattan wrapped in a mixture of golden streetlights and deep blue shadows. Parents were still helping sleepy children into their cars while volunteers waved goodbye from the front steps of the community center. I stood beside my aging sedan, holding my car keys, but neither of us seemed eager to leave. It felt strange how quickly a complete stranger had become someone whose company brought a sense of calm instead of uncertainty. Damien slipped his hands into the pockets of his jacket and looked across the quiet street. "Would you like to take a short walk?" he asked. I smiled. "As long as there are no fancy restaurants waiting at the end of it." He laughed softly. "I was thinking more about the park 2 blocks away." "That sounds much better." We crossed the street together and followed a tree-lined sidewalk until we reached a small neighborhood park overlooking the river. The evening breeze carried the faint scent of fresh grass and water. A few joggers passed us while an elderly couple slowly fed ducks from a nearby bench. The city felt quieter here, as though the noise had finally decided to rest for the night. We found an empty bench facing the river and sat without speaking for several minutes. The silence no longer needed explanation. Eventually, I looked at Damien. "Can I ask you another honest question? I would be disappointed if you stopped." I smiled before taking a slow breath. "Does it ever become lonely?" He turned toward me. "What does? Having everyone expect you to be strong all the time." His expression softened in a way I had not seen before. He looked back toward the water before answering. "More than most people realize." I waited quietly. "People become comfortable leaning on someone they believe cannot fall," he continued. "After a while, they stop asking whether that person ever needs someone to lean on as well." His words carried no resentment, only experience. "Who asked you that question?" I asked gently. He smiled, although there was sadness hidden behind it. "Very few people." Without thinking, I answered, "Maybe that is because very few people believe you would answer honestly." He looked at me for a long moment before giving a quiet nod. "You may be right." A gentle breeze stirred the leaves above us. Across the river, lights from apartment buildings reflected across the dark water like scattered stars. I rested my elbows on my knees and watched the ripples move with the current. "You know what surprised me the most today?" I asked. "What?" "Not that you support the community center." He waited. "It was seeing how every child ran toward you instead of standing back because they were intimidated." A genuine smile spread across his face. "Children notice things adults forget, such as whether someone listens." He paused before adding, "Children are rarely impressed by power. They are impressed by presence." That sentence settled somewhere deep inside me. I thought back to the ballroom, where hundreds of adults had become silent the moment he entered. Then I remembered the little boy proudly showing him a paper airplane and the little girl laughing as he admired her painting. Two completely different worlds had responded to the same man in completely different ways. "Maybe children see people more clearly than adults do," I said. "I believe they often do." At that moment, a small red rubber ball rolled across the sidewalk and stopped near Damien's shoe. A little boy hurried after it, breathing hard from the chase. Damien picked up the ball and crouched so they were eye level before handing it back. "Nice catch," the boy said proudly. "Thank you," Damien replied with complete sincerity, as though accepting praise from a professional athlete. The child grinned before running back toward his father. I watched the exchange with quiet amusement. "You never speak differently to children than you do to adults." Damien looked at me with the same calm expression he had worn since we first met. "Respect does not become more valuable because someone grows older. It should simply begin earlier." In that peaceful park beside the river, surrounded by ordinary families enjoying an ordinary evening, I realized the strongest person I had ever met was not the one who made people lower their voices when he entered a room. He was the one who made every person, no matter their age or circumstance, feel that their own voice was worth hearing.